It seems like from the moment I started reading comics, I had been told that comics were dying. If you're aware of the history of the medium, you would know that this phrase dates back to Frederick Wertham's Seduction of the Innocent, which greatly impacted sales and public perception. As the decades pass, the health of comics has been a constant topic of conversation, originating from those who said that comics would need to adapt to survive, and now in the modern day, criticizing comics for adapting with the times and not reflecting the comics of their youth. Go figure. What I've learned in my experience over time is that the history of the comics industry is cyclical. There's this repetition of the same mistakes not being corrected and only continuing into the future. Instead of chalking this up to ineffectual leadership, which is probably the case, I decided to address the issues at hand and hopefully start a dialogue for the future of comics. But as the saying goes, in order to understand our present, we must first understand our past. The first iteration of the comic book originated in... I'm just kidding. The market for comic sales as we know it to be today originated in 1972, when convention organizer and comic distributor Phil Suling approached several of the publishers asking for a means to purchase comics directly from the source. Prior to this, comics were sold in the independent market, which saw their presence alongside periodicals in grocery stores, convenience stores, toy stores, and pharmacies. I mean drugstores. This method allowed for retailers to refund any overstock comics that weren't able to be sold for credit back to the publishers. This practice had eventually declined in its popularity, and publishers leapt at the opportunity to change distribution practices. Underground comics, and that's comics with an X because of course it is, saw their rise to prominence in the late 1960s. Instead of being sold in the independent market, underground comics were sold in things called head shops, which are like smoke shops where you get all of your favorite drug paraphernalia. This would be pivotal in the success of underground comics, which sought out to push the medium forward, as well as telling stories with more mature themes and targeting an older audience. Around the mid-1970s, underground comics were losing popularity, and various underground magazines were looking for a new home. The structure of the distribution model would need to change into something that we know today to be the direct market, and bear with me as I attempt to explain this. In the updated model, the comic publishers would send their comics to distributors, and the distributors would, well, distribute them to retailers, but this time the retailers would be specialty stores, hence the birth of the comic shop. Comic shops order books for their customers in something called a pull list, which notifies the distributor of how many comics to be distributed to their retailers. The problem is that shops just need to make an educated guess for which issues to order. Obviously, your regulars will make up a list of each of the comic series that they want to subscribe to and continue pulling on a weekly basis. At the same time, comic shops need to accommodate for the regulars with commitment issues that aren't quite comfortable subscribing to a series. And then you have your dark horses. And no, I don't mean the comic publisher. These wildcards are the potential customers that buy issues on the day of and not notifying the shops in advance. The comic shop has little to go off of outside of which comics are selling, and those are the ones that are typically pre-ordered. Unfortunately, this system is just a gamble on if the retailers are able to successfully predict their customers' buying habits. This process shifts the burden from the comic publishers needing to credit for overstock and unsold comics, and now shifting that to the distributor and the retailers. This problem gave birth to the back issue. Now overstock comics could be sold in specialty stores alongside the weekly new releases. Back issues would be important to the rise of comic shops because collected editions of previously published comics wouldn't come until way later. So now customers could come in and spend endless hours rifling through each of the back issue bins trying to find that one last issue to fill in their knowledge of continuity. As time went on, the industry would acclimate to the new business model. Of course, there was an inherent issue in this practice, which is availability. Once you seclude your product, in this case comics, you effectively cut out a percentage of your potential customer base. With this updated business model, comics were relegated to specialty stores and thus not widely accessible anymore. I believe that this secluded approach is what gave way to the stigmatization of comics, and once you pair that with seduction of the innocent, it's not hard to see why comics have been outcasted in modern pop culture. Just within the past decade, comic shops have been able to shake the connotation that they had alongside sex shops, which are that the people that are customers are somehow deviants and outcasted from society. If we fast forward in time, the reaction to comic shops and specialty stores was generally positive for the comics industry. This time is known as the Bronze Age of comics. The Bronze Age is typically characterized to be a time of comics that would introduce darker themes and more mature stories for superheroes. It must be stated how important the ramifications of the Comics Code Authority would be for the comic issues published in the previous era, also known as the Silver Age. During this time, there was widespread restrictions on what could be published and what would be approved as a result. The Bronze Age was a response to the CCA, with instances like the cover to Green Arrow Green Lantern issue number 86 showing Roy Harper using heroin, with the following issue depicting the gruesome realities of withdrawal. Or over at Marvel with Spider-Man's story titled Green Goblin Reborn, following Harry Osborn's substance abuse as he's caught in the throes of nightclub culture. During the Bronze Age, the CCA would lift some of their restrictions, allowing for comic publishers to produce a wide variety of series and targeting several demographics at once. This would lay the framework for the expansion of comics as a medium, propelled by the releasing of Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns in 1985. As a result of this, the comics that were published during this time would increasingly adopt aspects of darker tones and more mature storytelling that were specifically catered to an adult audience. This, of course, was the industry learning the wrong lessons of Watchmen, as Watchmen was a deconstruction of that notion and pandering to an older demographic, but that's a video for another day. Leading into the 1990s, business was booming. Sales were through the roof, especially with X-Men #1 releasing by Chris Claremont and Jim Lee, that became the highest selling comic of all time, raking in a total of 8 million copies sold. Just prior to this time, the comics industry was flipped on its head as we saw the rise of the superstar artist. This would destabilize the notion of writers being the ones that were selling comics, and now comic artists had their value acknowledged and they were widely sought after by comic publishers. With their value over sales rising rapidly, they would now have the quote to ask more out of the contracts for the publishers if they were going to continue selling those books. Todd McFarlane spoke about the perspective of the superstar artists during this time by stating, "I saw what they did to the Kirbys of the world, people I looked up to. Then also within that, the fact that the audience sometimes just shifts to the cooler, hipper thing. If that's not you, then all of a sudden you can atrophy real quickly." To use an example, Kurt Swan, who did Superman for so long, the phone just stopped ringing because his thing wasn't as cool as what the new generation was doing. So it was suddenly like, Kurt doesn't draw like Jim, Rob, and Todd. Then suddenly, Kurt is now an old man and he's got no place to go. I saw that happen to a couple of people and thought, wow, okay, make sure you protect yourself against that. Meanwhile, the general public became exponentially more aware of comics and their value, with the issues releasing from the superstar artists that were working on them exponentially increasing in price and thus value to the general audience. At this point in time, comics weren't just stories anymore. They became investments. On December 19th of 1991, Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld, and Todd McFarlane would attend the first annual art auction hosted by Sotheby's. In this setting, they would be able to sell their original artwork for prices far exceeding the previously thought notions of the values attributable. At this same event, the first appearances of Batman and Captain Marvel would sell for an equally inflated price. The message was clear. comics are no longer disposable. This would lead to the cascading of speculators flooding the market, hoping to invest in the right kind of comics and finding that value later down the line to be equal or more than Detective Comics number 27. That didn't happen. Instead, just a few years later, the death of Superman would be the first in a long line of dominoes that would result in the decimation of the comics industry as well as bursting the speculator bubble. If the first appearance of Superman could be worth something, then of course the death of Superman would be equal in value, he says sarcastically, looking into the camera like Jim from The Office. Once speculators realized that comics weren't a get-rich-quick scheme, the market inevitably took a nosedive. If these purchases are solely dependent on mindless speculation, then comics revert to being disposable. Additionally, with each of the premier characters ballooning stories outside of just individual series, and now having long-running multiple books, it left for even dedicated fans to have this mass exodus, effectively killing the potential market of customers in the comics industry. This massive crash of the market, deriving from publishers overextending on comic sales, would lead to ripple effects for retailers, distributors, and publishers alike. But the comics industry survived. Comics weren't dead just yet, they just needed a shot in the leg to get back up. Unfortunately, the status quo of each publisher was severely impacted and diminished in sales, and is yet to really reclaim their status of that of the 90s. Well, that's just the background that we all needed to be caught up on before I get into the actual topic of today, which is history is repeating itself. It may sound like I'm raising unnecessary concerns, but evaluating the market data based on sales and purchasing habits of customers, it's hard not to look at the industry and see that we need an overcorrection to correct our course instead of going into the iceberg once again. And I guess that would make me either Billy Zane or Leonardo DiCaprio in this metaphor. The comics industry had another flashpoint moment, no pun intended, as a result of COVID-19 and the disruption that led to Diamond distributors ceasing all methods of distribution, which led to all of the comic publishers having to find alternate means to get their books to the audiences. Publishers like DC, Marvel, and Image were able to secure a new means of distribution and not hurting their bottom line. Others, like DSTLRY, just put band-aids on severed arteries and have now led to the hiatus of series being published indefinitely. More on them later. Rest assured. Even with the recovery in distribution, we're witnessing an added weight on the importance of pre-orders and sales of individual issues playing a larger role in the continuance of comic series. Within the past few years, it's become abundantly clear how rare it is for a comic series to go past 25 issues. During this time, Marvel has made their modus operandi to assess the health of a series at 10 issues, and cutting it off at the legs if it's not meeting the realistic expectations for that series. And within the past week, it's been revealed that the number has dropped from 10 issues to 5 issues. At time of recording, Dan Slott, the author with the most amount of Spider-Man comics under his belt, explicitly calls upon retailers and the audience to make sure that they continue supporting his upcoming Spider-Man book past the first issue, even saying that they need an audience there for issue 2 and issue 3 because nothing's guaranteed. And don't take my word for it, let's cut to a clip.
If you are a reader and you had fun reading my run of Spider-Man and you want more of it, please put this on your pull list now. If you are a retailer, we know you're going to order issue number 1 well. No doubt, everyone always does that with number 1. This is me talking to you. I need you on issue 2. I need you to order this like you're ordering your Dan Slott Spider-Man comic for issue 2, instead of hey, there's 12 other books with blind bags and I'm going to put all my money into that. We're at a point now where Marvel is, when books come out, Marvel books come out, no matter what they are, they're lined up for 5 issues at a time. And what that means is if you don't support the issue 2s and 3s, these books will go away by issue 5. you got to get me past issue 5. And the way to do that is to order well on 2 and order well on 3.
So at this point in time, Marvel has a lack of confidence not only in the series published, but also established creators that are in their employ, that they aren't allowing for any sort of leniency towards anyone. And I can't even be surprised anymore, because this has been the writing on the wall based on Marvel's treatment of Jonathan Hickman and all of the pursuits that he's had while at the company, namely Krakoa, the Ultimate Universe, Imperial, and Gods. All of these initiatives came to a premature conclusion, or just stripping the creative control away from Jonathan Hickman and not allowing him to see out his vision. Of course, DC is no better, as evidenced by their treatment of black characters, relegating them to a once-a-year annual issue or limiting them to a 6-issue miniseries. Friend of the show, JP Numbra, created the website DCSoWhite.com, which displays the days since DC has had an ongoing main continuity series with a black lead. At time of writing, the count is currently 1,127 days since the last book of this kind was published by DC. Just as a side note, I highly recommend visiting the website and reading more about the message behind this movement to demand diversity and representation for top publishers. A part of me believes that the insistence of short runs of series is just a method to produce as many new first issues as possible, as number ones have the highest likelihood of selling. But on the other hand, I also feel like the leadership categorically does not understand their audience and is just throwing out every practice that worked in the past and hoping something sticks. Whether it's maliciousness or just an example of them being ineffectual, it paints the same picture. There needs to be changes. We can see in retrospect which speculation markets were volatile and subject to variances based on tangibility and longevity of assets. NFTs and crypto markets tanked with speculators, so they shifted their sights onto assets with perceived static volatility and increasing in value. With an increase in disposable income, speculator markets began erupting in popularity. Everything from Pokemon cards to JPEGs were subject to speculation. If there was rarity or exclusivity, people would dump life savings into it and call it an investment. And to quote a famous philosopher, "All my apes gone." And unfortunately, that's why we gather here today, to talk about how speculators are killing comics. Variant covers are not a new phenomenon in comics. Like the name suggests, variants originated from showing the same cover based on independent market or direct market. The newsstand edition of comics, or in the independent market, has a substantially higher prestige to that of the direct market because they didn't have overstock. So that's why whenever the same issue is sold both at newsstand and the direct market, the newsstand is the one with higher value. The idea of variant covers incorporating distinct images for the same comic issue and distributed to the direct market would originate in Man of Steel #1 by John Byrne. So like most other cancerous things that are plaguing the comics industry, it originates from somebody who's self-described as a company man. Variants caught the speculation market by storm in the 90s comic boom, with publishers proliferating shops with alternate covers, catering to the demand of consumers. This would also lead to the emergence of gimmick covers, such as lenticular, glow-in-the-dark, embossed, etc. These gimmick covers sought out to artificially inflate the perceived rarity of each comic, leading speculation prices to surge. After the implosion of comics in the 90s, publishers avoided the same practices that had led them to their demise, restricting their sales practices being completely bolstered by speculators. Of course, this self-restraint wasn't long-lasting, with Marvel and DC gradually incorporating variants back into sales practices in the mid-aughts with books like Identity Crisis and New Avengers. It wasn't a perfect system, and there were, of course, publishers reverting back to the practices of the 90s, but it seemed like at this point in time, we had learned from the mistakes of the past and were not destined to repeat them. That is, until 2020 and the ramifications of COVID. Like I stated earlier, this point in time led to speculation reaching an all-time high, with the masses having an increased disposable income and searching out speculative markets. Comics in particular were subject to these markets, seeing issues surge past previously thought expectations and resulted in speculators using each new comic book day to that of day trading. As comics would release, speculators flooded comic stores, purchasing a myriad of variant covers, hoping for at least one to increase in the value on the secondhand market. Variant covers like that of Peach Momoko would be the most sought after, even leading to a fist fight that broke out during one of her signings at a comic convention. Speculation hit a fever pitch, and publishers leaned into the speculative practices of the 90s once again, partnering with secondary markets to release exclusive variants for those platforms and further emboldening speculators in comic sales. These practices weren't even limited to Marvel and DC either, with independent publishers like Dynamite and IDW also cashing in on speculation. In 2025, we saw each comic publisher incorporate an evolution of variant covers, the blind bag. To catch you up to speed, blind bags are individual comics that are sold in tinted polybags. The gimmick of its implementation is randomizing the variant covers so each can range from a common variant with low value or an extremely rare variant, making that issue skyrocket in the value based on exclusivity. DC used blind bags for Batman #1 and the summer event DC KO, charging these at a surplus because each are guaranteed to have foil variants. Marvel and IDW also utilized this practice, however charged for an equal price to that of a standard comic. Customers would be purchasing these blind bags, with most instances opening them within the comic shops, bursting at the seams with anticipation at the likelihood of being the new recipient of a comic with extreme rarity and value. So for this video, I ended up getting a blind bag for Daredevil issue 1 by Stephanie Phillips and Lee Garbett. So let's find out what we got. Okay, so this is another cover, and we got the Peach Momoko Daredevil cover. I don't know, you tell me in the comments if this is actually worth something, or if anybody wants it, I mean, it's up for grabs. Of course, these blind bags were a hit with speculators and fans alike, and you can call me pretentious all you like, but it only further concerned me for the trajectory of the industry. 2025 and moving into 2026 was dominated by the utilization of blind bags for new series, but it didn't just stop at a first issue. Soon publishers would commit to using blind bags for the entirety of the series, artificially inflating the sales of that series. Put a pin in that, I'm going to come back to it in a minute. These blind bags transformed the purchasing of an issue into the enjoyment derived from the covers that were able to be obtained. Blind bags have effectively become the Pokemon cards or CSGO Lotto for comics. Yes, there is a guaranteed return for the purchasing of each issue, but there's a disparity incentivizing the purchasing of multiple blind bags for more of an opportunity at cashing out. This leads into what I was saying about the inflation of sales as a result of this gimmick. I first learned at the implementation of blind bags for an independent series that was ongoing when I looked at ICV2's top 50 list for comics in December of 2025. There should be a disclaimer that this information isn't a direct reflection of sales overall, but just some comic shops' pre-orders. These charts can give us a cursory glimpse into each series being published and which are topping the charts based on publishing practices. For the month of December 2025, Mark Spears' Monster issue number 8 ranked in at the 6th spot, sitting between the DC/Marvel Batman/Deadpool issue, and Absolute Batman number 14. 2 months prior, it came in at number 3 between Absolute Batman number 13 and the Absolute Batman Annual. After a bit of investigation, I was able to find out that the series was utilizing blind bags as a gimmick to overinflate sales for an independent publisher I had previously been ignorant of, KeenSpot. Additional research led me to uncover that KeenSpot is a relatively small publisher, finding a runaway success with the acquisition of Mark Spears' trading card game turned hit comic Kickstarter. It seems like Mark Spears called in every industry connection that he possibly had to do a cover for this book, and in turn KeenSpot would benefit by way of utilizing blind bags and overinflating the sales, as well as getting awareness of their publisher for the wider demographic of comics and comic speculators. It obviously worked, with the first issue selling 350,000 copies, but to what end? When looking into this book, next to nothing pops up in results for the actual narrative, but instead an assortment of praise and confusion for why this comic sold as well as it did. Senior staff writer for CBR, Brian Cronin, perfectly summarized my thoughts by stating, "With blind bags though, you're purchasing the chance of getting something rare. In other words, it's basically just like playing the lottery. You're not buying a cool cover, you're buying a chance at a rare, i.e. valuable variant cover. There is a disconnect there that goes away from the historical enjoyment of cool comic book art and into pure gambling." Again, plenty of comic book fans are really excited about blind bags, and I don't want to yuck their yum, but I also don't want to get too far away from the celebration of cool comics rather than scoring some valuable commodity. I believe that blind bags are a symptom of the industry caring more about sales and the achievements of a series instead of the quality of the books published. Yes, we can celebrate whenever books are selling, but at what point do we think critically about the longevity of those sales? I mean, Harley Quinn and Elvira had a comic that came out and supposedly broke 100,000 issues sold. Do you expect me to believe that that was on the merit of the story, or is this gimmick only playing into the same mistakes made in the industry just under 30 years ago? Additionally, is this practice something that can be maintained by smaller publishers, just in the off chance that they aren't edged out of the market due to the sheer market share and influence that the top publishers have? It seems to me like publishers are staking their success on the speculation of blind bags, which will eventually lead to their demise, and unfortunately will create an omen for the industry at large. As we spoke about before, the industry shifted to the direct market in the 70s, and has operated in that way since. What we didn't talk about is the impact of digital on the comics industry, and I feel like this is a crucial aspect that has been overlooked for quite some time. ComiXology was launched in July of 2007 and served a different purpose for what it would eventually become. Originally, ComiXology would be a resource for readers to access information to upcoming releases of comics and forming pull lists with their local comic shops. It would provide access to covers, descriptions, credits, page counts, and miscellaneous information regarding each book, with readers able to formulate an ideal understanding of the comics releasing and be exposed to publishers outside of the big two. The website would also be a central hub for columns, blogs, news, and podcasts regarding comics. ComiXology would expand their capabilities in July of 2009 to that of a digital marketplace for comics. The service would host comic publishers' new releases and older published works, establishing itself as the primary digital comic service available. This change would revolutionize the consumption of comics in the modern day. No longer were fans beholden to purchasing physical issues at their LCS, and now had the opportunity to maintain their entire catalog of digitally purchased comics in their devices. ComiXology would later be acquired by Amazon, with a conglomerate expanding into the comics industry. This alteration of the business model, as well as the dominance of Amazon over the medium, set the comics industry ablaze. Would this kill comics? Would comic shops be irrelevant? Is Jeff Bezos just Ozempic Dan DiDio? Well, first, let me answer your questions for you. No, and actually maybe. It's understandable for the industry to be apprehensive regarding the rise of digital comics, leaving an air of uncertainty for how they would need to adapt to the times. Listening to the older episodes of the Word Balloon podcast sheds light on the temperature from creators at the time. Most seemed excited by the potential growth of comics to a wider audience, while others echoed the sentiments of retailers who believed that this is the nail in the coffin for their livelihood. Obviously, the retailers' voices were the most important to comic publishers, with distribution closely following. A disruption in the standardized business model would require growing pains and adjustments. It didn't help that retailers began pointing fingers at ComiXology at the slightest fluctuation in sales. In response to the retailer outcry, ComiXology integrated an affiliate program for comic shops to opt into, sharing a percentage of the revenue from the sales generated by their customers on ComiXology. All the while, retailers remained adamant that digital comics would destroy the comic industry. ComiXology worked alongside publishers, establishing the prices for new releases not being lower than the prices of their physical counterpart. This is where we began seeing a decline in alternatives outside of the direct market. Surely there were options available to lessen the price of these issues if purchased digitally, but since retailers believed that this was an affront to their business, comics had no choice but to remain a standard cost for either distribution model. Once Amazon acquired ComiXology, the industry restarted their claims that the turbulent market was a result of digital comics. Shortly thereafter, publishers implemented their own digital comic services, allowing for customers to use a subscription model to read older comic issues that were previously published, or new issues that were releasing at a delay of 3 to 6 months. While these services were and remain to be helpful for reading out-of-print stories or discovering hidden gems of the past, I still think that it's limiting to have a model released at a substantial delay, and it's only going to further limit the audience for new readers coming into comics. Manga services like Shonen Jump's app make the stories available at time of publication, with volumes of the same stories also selling exponentially well in comparison to Western comics. Additionally, manga isn't relegated to being purchased at specialty stores, but a wide array of access to audiences. In 2018, DC partnered with Walmart to have a display case of DC comics in their stores, albeit with inopportune areas for accessibility. I mean, what were they thinking putting them alongside the trading cards? But that's a story for another day, but at least they were trying something new. Unfortunately, retailers also rebelled at this notion and strong-armed publishers to release direct market editions of the books produced under this partnership, all the while bemoaning any attempts of expanding beyond sales in specialty stores. While there's plenty of digital comic apps, there's little in the way of digital comic marketplaces that are in competition with ComiXology's hold on Western comics. Marketplaces being defined as a place to purchase comics from directly. While there's apps like Marvel Unlimited and DC Infinite, the model of selling books through a third-party service has seen little in the way of obtaining a larger market share on digital. The Omnibus app sprung up in 2023, daring to correct the mistakes of ComiXology and vying to be its replacement. That ultimately didn't happen for a myriad of reasons, with the predominant one being that Omnibus couldn't compete at the same level financially to that of ComiXology. On the Omnibus app, the collected editions were sold at the same price for those same editions if you bought them in print. When you look over at ComiXology, they're not only able to sell at a discount, but then massively reducing that price. Omnibus wasn't able to gain the amount of traction that they had sought out, and inevitably shuttered the app in mid-2024. In 2025, we saw the emergence of a new digital marketplace, Neon Ichiban. If you've followed me on Twitter for some time, you'll know that I have a specific bone to pick with them in particular. Neon Ichiban was founded by David Steinberger, former CEO of ComiXology, and Chip Mosher, pioneer of ComiXology Originals, as well as a comic industry veteran. Prior to the establishment of Neon Ichiban, the two had founded the comic publisher DSTLRY. Like I had alluded to earlier, DSTLRY wasn't adaptive to the market fluctuation after the loss of Diamond distribution, leading to their books going on indefinite hiatus. I criticized the company for their inelasticity in regard to distribution, which is supposed to be their area of expertise. During this time of uncertainty in their books being produced, the co-founders sought out for a new business venture that came to be Neon Ichiban. Now, I may just be a comic YouTuber with a bachelor's in business administration, but I feel like there should be some sort of stability in your foundation established in the business that you're running before you're overextending into digital marketplaces. Chip Mosher responded to me on Twitter, condescendingly asserting that there was nothing to worry about in regards to Distillery's publishing and that both companies had a bright future ahead of them. And I take no joy in this, but it was announced in February of 2026 that Distillery Books would place all of their series on hiatus until they re-established the means of publishing. Alright, time out, pause, this guy is wrong. Well, not really wrong, he was just a little bit outdated, and while I was making this video, Distillery had an announcement that said that they were going to continue publishing their books in April or May of 2026. So Distillery just took 2 months off and is not stopping production for all of their books. So, he can chill out, and I just wanted to, fact check. But anyways, back to the video. At the same time, you can look into the practices of Neon Ichiban and see the glaring flaws in their business model and an over-reliance on speculation as a centerpiece of their differentiators. They are able to be competitive in pricing, an improvement from their predecessor Omnibus. However, they specifically market a new technology that I find dubious at best. They tout a new feature titled Remarks, which claim to allow for creators to sign and personalize issues, effectively making this digital comic a collector's item. If your ears perked up at the last sentence, that means that you've been paying attention, because that sounds an awful lot like an NFT. Looking into how it's put into practice, you can see that they have Watchmen issue number 12 proudly displayed on their homepage. Clicking into the page, you see that this was signed and sketched by Dave Gibbons himself, with the original listing going for $50 and currently listed for resale at $200. Looking a little bit closer, you can see that this issue isn't able to be downloaded, and the actual ownership is exclusive to the Neon Ichiban website. I mean, I could easily just right-click and look here, I also own the issue. What's to stop me from screenshotting every single remarked editions and just claiming that they're mine? Additionally, the press release stated that they would be giving a percentage of the revenue generated by Remarks editions back to the creators. And when I asked where I can find specific information in regards to the percentage or clarity of the intricacies of Remarks, I was pointed to their FAQ. So let's take a look, shall we? Okay, so that didn't work, but I was able to finally uncover the results through an alternate means, which also gave me no true insights into this process or its implementation. And this is exactly what I'm talking about. It's a lack of transparency, a disregard for the actual health of the industry, and continuing to double down on poor business practices that are just courting speculators into this market. And honestly, I can't even blame Neon Ichiban either, because Whatnot has also incorporated similar practices, and really it's either a betting or bidding website on everything from comics to collectibles. If the 2010s were the decade of subscription services rising to prominence, then the 2020s will be defined as the decade of speculation and gambling. So you may have gotten to this point in the video and be wondering wondering, if these are the problems with the industry, then what do you propose for the solution? And honestly, I just have to refer you back to the last section where I said that I'm a comic YouTuber with a bachelor's in business admin, and not a comic industry veteran or someone with a financial stake in seeing this industry succeed. The entire point of the video is to shed light on where we're trending as someone who's only watching from the sidelines. It's a trajectory that's abundantly evident and only inevitable if it continues to be left unaddressed. If you truly want to bring in new readers, it's not beneficial to indulge in speculation, but instead to focus on the accessibility of books. I've spoken to a variety of people who live outside of the US who say that prices of comics are astronomical, and they also don't have access to any of the digital services that we can use to read comic apps, so they have to resort to just pirating comics. The only way to replicate the successes of manga is to also replicate the accessibility of manga. It should be imperative that comic publishers focus on the longevity of sales and not short-term successes and trends. Invest back into your audience, listen to the problems of your business model, and if you do everything correctly, maybe, just maybe, we won't be doing this again in another 30 years. Anyway, that's going to be enough out of me. If you like this video, give it a like, and if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. I want to thank Korenzik and all of my supporters over on Patreon for help making these videos possible. And one last thing, go read some comics. Okay, so this is the Daredevil blind bag. Let's see what we got. It feels like something else is in here too. Let's see. A cigar. Maybe it's not all bad.